Let's talk about the main event. Let's get here. Lots of rumor and innuendo. I've been looking forward to talking about this. You and I've touched on it on some live shows, and you have an idea of where I'll fall on this, and I'm ready to fight again. So here we go. I guess we should back up. For a long time on Nitro, JJ Dillon would show up and offer a contract for Sting to wrestle different members of the NWO, whether it was Kurt or Six or whoever. Sting would always rip up the contracts. The fans would start to chant Hulk Hogan or Hogan, and Sting would point to the crowd. And eventually the contract signing happens October 25th, and it airs during a commercial break for Hogan's movie Assault on Devil's Island, which did a 4.2 rating. And it was shown again on November 3rd. It starts with Hogan telling everyone to shut up, calls them idiots, says Sting's a coward. He's not going to show up. And then of course he does with a baseball bat. He signs the contract and then points the bat at Hulk and walks backwards off stage. And it was said on air that this happened at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. Where did it really happen? When did you tape it? Whose idea was it to air it in the middle of the Hogan movie like this?
It was my idea to air it in the middle of the movie because we thought we'd have a bigger audience than we might have for a Nitro, which proved to be true. I don't remember where we produced it. That I'm not even sure I was there.
Okay. Let's talk about the match. Of course, Sting's going to win the WCW for the fourth time here. He beats Hulk Hogan in just under 13 minutes. And Meltzer would say Sting in a sleeveless outfit looked really small compared to the past. Hogan looked lighter than usual as well. Not much of a match. And he's going to go on and break down the match, but I've always been curious, for, I don't know, almost a year, maybe a little more. We've seen Sting in the rafters and rappelling down, and here he just walks in from the back like everybody else. Why the deviation? Was it the right call? Was it a mistake? It certainly added to his character and the mystique of Sting for him to come down from the rafters. Why change that here?
Well, common sense, right? Whenever Sting came down from the rafters, he wasn't announced. He wasn't booked. He wasn't in a match. It was a surprise attack. It was Sting coming from out of nowhere to break up whatever was going on. That's an effective use of, the coming from the rafters kind of an entrance. It didn't make any sense for him to come from the rafters on a match at a pay-per-view where he's been previously booked and there was a contract signing. Just creatively made no sense. I mean, I guess you could have done it for the sake of doing it and argue that, it's consistent. So, there's an argument for it. And I wouldn't necessarily argue too hard against that. But in the moment, in the context of that time, it really didn't make any sense.
To me, it didn't make any sense for him to be in the back. If he's really a loner, why is he in the back sharing a locker room with all the guys? Why is he?
He didn't share a locker room. He had his own locker room. He was a loner.
We didn't see that.
Well, didn't need to see it.
Well, okay.
I'm fucking with you.
I know you're doing the Bruce Pritchard routine.
I'm trying to be funny and I'm not, but arguably you're right. That's something that could have been done. We could have, hypothetically or in retrospect, we could have possibly enhanced his entrance on that particular pay-per-view by establishing that he still wasn't associating with anybody in WCW. He was still that, crow, distant lone wolf type character. We didn't do that. Do I think, or would you suggest that it would have had any measurable effect on the outcome of this pay-per-view? I don't think so.
No, not at all. But that's what we do. We break down the details here on the show. Let's talk about what Meltzer wrote about the backstory, because this is really well done. And he has to tip his cap too. With carefully orchestrated theatrics and regular run-ins as time was running out on Monday nights, some segments which were actually botched made Sting the second highest merchandise seller in the business, only behind Steve Austin. All this while never wrestling a match. At first, Sting was supposed to make his triumphant return to the ring in February of '97 at the Cow Palace for Super Brawl, but the gimmick was working so well, they decided to hold him out for almost all of 1997, climaxing with his winning the WCW title from Hulk Hogan in Starrcade. It was obvious the gimmick was paying off big. Anticipation for the match reached a level unseen in pro wrestling in this country in many years. The signing of the contract during a break-in of a Hogan movie on TNT drew one of the largest made-for-cable movie ratings in history. it would be a turn of a great phrase to say that 16 months of work was exposed about halfway through Sting's walk down the aisle before he ever got in the ring. The mythical superhero turned human right before the fans' very eyes. Now, that is something that, since you and I have spoken about this very recently on some of our live shows, I did not realize that Meltzer wrote, but I feel like you probably agree, because you and I have argued about this off air quite a bit about why the decision was made to do something different. And you and I even talked about this way back when you appeared on Woo Nation, the original Ric Flair podcast. And you sort of told the story of how you guys had a meeting the day of Starrcade. And by guys, I mean Sting, Hulk Hogan, and yourself. Catch us up from there. Everybody knows what the finish is going to be. This is the big payoff. Sting's leaving with the title, but then you show up at the building, get everybody together, take it from here.
Along the lines of the end, the end always hangs on the beginning. Your commentary, or you revisiting the commentary from Dave Meltzer, that's kind of ironically, it was the end. And the beginning of this started for me. I mean, Dave's own reaction to, and pointing out the fact that, the mythical character and the illusion that we spent 16 or 17 months creating kind of dissipating, halfway down the aisle. I agree with that. And actually that's the same way that both Hulk and I felt earlier in the day. There was a massive amount of anticipation on everyone's part, the fans, everybody in WCW, pay-per-view company. I mean, everybody felt, we knew this was going to be the show of shows for WCW up to this point. And everybody, and I'm not just talking about Hogan for sure, everybody had worked so hard for 16 or 17 months for this particular moment. Other talent, writers, producers, everybody, Sting himself, everybody had worked really hard at getting to this exact moment. So let's go back to earlier in the day. I got to the building probably about 11 o'clock in the morning, a little earlier than I normally would for a pay-per-view. We were on the East Coast. Obviously, the pay-per-view didn't start till I think 8 o'clock at night. Typically, I would get to the building around noon or 1 o'clock for a production meeting, but I got there a little bit earlier that day, probably because I was thinking about my own match, and I knew that I was going to be a little busier or more distracted at the very least, because I was going to be in the ring. And I was intimidated by that, by the way. I'm not going to lie. It's the first time I had ever done it. I didn't want to let anybody down. That was my biggest fear. I wasn't worried about embarrassing myself or doing anything stupid, but I was worried about, I didn't want to let Larry down. I didn't want to let Brett down. I didn't want to let anybody down, especially the fans. I wanted it to have a good payoff. And I was slightly preoccupied with that. So I got to the building early. Things went pretty well. I think Sting got to the building about 1:30, 2 o'clock, which would have been right about on time for him. Now, we had pretty much had an idea we knew what the finish was going to be going into this. So there was no question about, who was going to win and who was going to lose. We knew that. We had known that for 12 months. The question was, how do we get there? So Sting showed up in my dressing room. Hulk was already there. And when he walked in, I don't want to over dramatize this. And I also want to say, I'm not going to share everything in this recall, because some of this stuff was personal to Steve Borden, AKA Sting. And since he's never shared it, it's not up to me to do that. Just not going to do it. But I will give you as much information as I can. So Sting walks in, and both Terry and I kind of had the same, we didn't acknowledge it to each other, but we both had a similar reaction, which is, wow, he doesn't look very excited about this. This was before we had one syllable of a conversation about what the finish was going to be or how we were going to get there. Sting, much like Meltzer observed during Sting's walkout, Sting had the same lack of energy or presence, I guess is even a better way of saying it. It was almost like he was only half there when he walked in the room. Now, Sting had, and I think he has acknowledged in the past, that he was going through a lot of personal things in his life at the time. And ironically, because I had become very close to Sting leading up to this particular angle. Sting came out to Wyoming with his former wife and, was looking and buying property right down the road from me. And we went to Yellowstone together and did a bunch of nature photography. I mean, we rode Harleys together. I'd occasionally go over to his house on the weekends. And when the weather was good in Atlanta, we'd jump on our Harleys and drive around. So it wasn't like we just had a purely business relationship. Certainly not best friends or anything like that. But we were close enough where we would talk generally. I didn't know, because, Sting, during the whole Crow angle as it began, and the character just kind of showed up in the rafters and didn't really talk and didn't really engage with anybody. Well, that wasn't just the character. That was really what was going on with Steve Borden. Steve used to be, he wasn't like a huge party animal. Not at all, as a matter of fact. He wasn't the guy, hanging out with the boys at the bar. He wasn't that kind of a social animal. He and Lex, even, prior to all of this, pretty much stayed to themselves. They didn't hang out with the team, so to speak, after the shows. But Steve was always very sociable. You'd see him backstage, and he was always talking to people and laughing and joking and playing cards and doing all the things most guys did. But once we started the Crow character and that angle leading up to this pay-per-view, I didn't really notice it a lot at first, the first several months, but Sting would show up very late because he didn't, we weren't working out finishes. He wasn't cutting promos. He wasn't doing all the things that normally would happen during a show. He was simply showing up. We knew what the stunt was. We knew what the entrance was. We knew when it was going to be. It was pretty cut and dry. So he'd get to the building in time to rehearse the rappel with Ellis Edwards, and then he'd go off by himself. And he didn't socialize a lot. I quit socializing or talking to Steve just as much simply because I just didn't see him. He'd come into the building and do his thing, and he'd leave. And he was almost like a ghost, very similar to his character, believe it or not. So what we didn't realize, and what a lot of us didn't know, is just the depth of the personal issues that Steve was having in his life. It wasn't apparent to us. Now at Starrcade, now fast forward 16 months. Now we show up at Starrcade, and now it's time to kind of change that pattern. Steve had to get to the building pretty early. Now it's time to sit down and talk. And I know this is going to sound ridiculous, but none of us had seen Steve without his gimmick on, right? We didn't realize that he quit working out. We didn't realize, for example, I know this sounds artificial or superficial, I should say, and childish, but he didn't even bother to tan. And I know that sounds funny to people who aren't in the business, but I guarantee you everybody that you watch on WWE spends a certain amount of time maintaining their tan, however they do it, naturally or unnaturally. You've got to take care of your body. You're out there in your underwear, for crying out loud. You got to look the part, right? And when Steve came in, he was substantially smaller. He'd obviously had not been to the gym, agreeing with the point that Dave made that he noticed during the walkout. We noticed when Steve walked into our room. He'd obviously not been to the gym. There was no preparation, physically on Steve's part. He hadn't even bothered to spend 20 minutes getting a spray tan, for crying out loud. So, and Hulk and I talked about it after the fact, long after the fact, certainly not in that moment. But I think we both recognized the same thing, that this guy that just walked into the room, Steve Borden, is a shell of the Steve Borden that we thought we were going to see. And it was almost shocking in a way. I mean, that's not saying he was emaciated and, run down and look like a wino. That's not true either. But what we expected, given the magnitude of what we had built and where we knew we were going to go and what we were planning on doing, we expected somebody to come in to that room ready to play at the very highest level. And what we saw was the same thing that Dave Meltzer saw.
So the original plan, tell us what the original plan for the finish was and when, why you thought it needed to, you explained why it needed to pivot, but what the pivot was and who suggested it.
This is going to piss a lot of people off. The original finish was Sting was going to go over. How he was going to go over, that wasn't my deal. I didn't ever get involved, even at this point, in the details of a finish. Just wasn't my strength. I can't emphasize that enough. And rather than engaging myself and involving myself in things that I knew I didn't really know enough about, I let the talent have a lot to say, especially somebody like Steve and Hulk Hogan. Who better, who on our roster of talent, not talking about wrestlers, but in terms of producers and bookers and whatever you want to call them, agents, who better than to figure out a great finish for that particular match than the two guys involved, right? In normal circumstances, that would have been easy to do. This was not a normal circumstance. We knew what the finish was that we wanted before we got to the building, before we got on a plane. We knew about it months in advance. We knew we wanted Sting to go over. How he went over, he had to go over strong. We had to end this story exactly the way the audience wanted it to end, on the highest note possible. That was the finish going in. How we were going to get there on a step-by-step basis, I can't tell you because I wasn't involved. Now, in terms of the changes as a result of really feeling and believing, as much as, I like Sting as a human being, as a friend, as a performer, as one of the most loyal WCW, talents on the roster, he wasn't up for it. It's like I want to try to do an adequate job of explaining this without overstating it. It's almost like he didn't believe it was actually going to happen long before he got to months ago. Maybe when the whole angle first started. I'm not saying he felt this way. I'm saying this is the impression that I had. I'll speak for myself. The impression I had is that this whole big buildup, he never believed it was really going to happen. He believed he was going to get screwed out of an opportunity, and he quit 6 months before this event. He quit caring. He quit taking care of himself. He quit preparing. He showed up with no energy, with no anticipation, with no enthusiasm. It was just like, okay, you guys are going to fuck me, so let's get it over with. That was the vibe that I got. I don't think he really felt that way, but that was the vibe he was giving off. And as a result of that, we probably went through 5 or 6 different, alternatives and options, maybe more, because we knew we were in trouble. Terry, after, we talked with Steve and Terry and myself, Steve left the room and we said, okay, let's reconvene in an hour. Let's think about where we're at. Let's think about what we've talked about so far, and then we'll come back and pick it up again in an hour. Because sometimes you just got to let this stuff kind of set in and start to visualize it and make sense out of it. And after Steve walked out the door, Terry and I both just looked at each other, and Terry said, brother, he's not ready. He's not into this. I agreed with him. Not because he was Hulk Hogan, and as Dave Meltzer or, any other dirt sheet writer probably would have wanted to write at the time, that, I was letting, Hulk Hogan run the company. It wasn't it. It just wasn't it. And as evidenced, not that I'll ever use Dave Meltzer to prove a point, but, the same vibe that Meltzer had was the same vibe that we had. It's like, dude, we spent almost a year and a half building this angle. We've sacrificed, I don't mean sacrifice, but we've used so many great characters along the way to escalate this arc and to make sure that it builds appropriately. We maintain momentum. We've done something that had never really been done before in recent wrestling history, and hasn't been done yet, by the way, which is, creating a story at the very beginning and building it over the course of 17 or 18 months. And not only doing it, but doing it as well as we did. Almost flawless, arguably, to be honest about it. So to get to that moment and to feel before we even, had lunch, like the air was out of the bag, was very disappointing for everybody. I'm sure it was disappointing for Steve. I know it was disappointing for Terry. I know I was disappointed, and I know everybody that had to figure out how to solve this problem was as frustrated as we all were.
So you guys make the pivot to do the screw job finish. How do you lay it out to Nick Patrick and Bret Hart?
Again, I'm not begging off. And if I would have been involved in it, I would walk you through, my involvement in it. I was involved in the discussion in terms of, okay, we've got to change the finish. We've got to come up with something different than what we came up with, because what we came up with isn't going to really work. Then it went to, the Kevin Sullivans and Terry himself and Steve and everybody involved. And I'm sure that, Terry Taylor probably chimed in to a degree, as he would and should have. I didn't get involved in the finish or the details of it.